This is my journey growing up in the pre-conciliar church, living through Vatican Council II, enduring its aftermath, and coming home to tradition. I hope you enjoy it and that it offers you some encouragement and hope. Stella meus in oriente. I was born in 1951, so I lived my early childhood and grade school years prior to or during the council. My grade school, Christ Our King in Wilmington, Delaware, was a typical Catholic grade school of the 1950s, staffed by religious, in this case the Sisters of St. Joseph of Chestnut Hill in Philadelphia, and packed. There were 82 children in my first grade class. Contrary to the fabricated stories about Catholic schools of this era and the mean sisters, it was a nurturing, even if challenging, environment. The sisters were dedicated solely to our welfare, spiritually and academically. I came from a dysfunctional family, alcoholism, abuse, and I can say without hesitation that but for the grace of God poured out through the hands of those sisters, I would surely have been in a juvenile detention center, not because they disciplined me, but because they cared for me. Were they strict? Yes, but the whole culture was strict. They did not stick out as abnormal. At that time, everyone had clearly defined roles in society. If someone broke the rules of that role, he was punished. This was true at school, at home, in the workplace. It's just the way the culture worked. It's also most likely how it was possible to have 82 children in my first grade class with a single teacher, Sister St. Martin. As a school, we attended Mass weekly during most of the year, but daily during Advent and Lent. We also went to confession every week or two. The Masses were low Masses, the traditional Latin Mass. The only change in the Mass that I can remember during this time, the late 50s and early 60s, was some congregational singing that was inserted into low Masses on Sundays, largely due to the enthusiasm of one particular priest. However, there were no changes to the Mass itself. For 7th and 8th grades, I attended St. Edmund's Academy, which was staffed by the Brothers of the Holy Cross. Academically, it was a little more rigorous than the parish school had been, which to me meant just more homework. In the 8th grade, I experienced my first lay teachers, Mr. Morrow and Mr. Chu, who taught history and English respectively. Mr. Morrow was also my first non-Catholic teacher. Other than these changes, the spiritual and cultural environment was like that of the parish school. I was graduated from 8th grade in 1965, a few months before the council concluded. For 9th grade, I attended Salesianum High School, a Catholic boys' school staffed by the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. To be honest, the difficulties at home escalated that year to the point that I remember little about this school, except for Father Lawler, my Latin teacher, who was brilliant and demanding. The next year, in 1966, we moved from Wilmington, Delaware, to Hagerstown, Maryland, where I attended St. Maria Goretti High School, a co-ed school staffed by the School Sisters of Notre Dame. That year, things began to change rapidly and dramatically. In the spring of 1967, the sisters modified their habits, and we had a few more lay teachers. The weekly school masses had more and more English, a folk group, and substitutions of mass parts, such as entrance songs for the introit and a responsorial psalm instead of the gradual. Now, I don't remember the exact progression of these changes. Did they happen before they were authorized in March of 1967? Probably not. But the rapidity with which they happened after the authorization was breathtaking. It seemed like it was almost overnight. My first inkling that something was wrong occurred when the music changed. Now, I was not an authority on the musical patrimony of the church, but the music we were suddenly singing and the electric instruments we were using were things that belonged in nightclubs, bars, concert stages, anywhere but in church. At the same time, it's important to note that these changes were not implemented by an unwilling clergy. To the contrary, they were led by the clergy, and we had been raised to have the utmost respect for the clergy, which meant unquestioning obedience. We were taught to have the same respect for the teaching authority of the church, which they represented, and which we knew would never be used to lead us astray. So whether I liked these changes was irrelevant. They were certainly for my spiritual benefit, even if I could not see that, or so I thought. In 1969, I attended college at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I studied organ. The program was fully committed to preparing students to serve parishes in the context of the post-conciliar reforms. However, we in the program were also committed to bringing to the Mass music of a higher caliber than what was coming from the flood of folk groups in the church. For the most part, this resulted in using Protestant hymns and anthems and what I would call utilitarian music composed for various parts of the new Mass. It was a battle we were destined to lose. By the 1970s, I was spending as much time tuning 12-string guitars, something of an oxymoron, as I was teaching choirs from the great treasury of the church. Certainly chant was not a part of anything. It was not taught at the university, and it had disappeared from parish masses. 1969 was also a significant year in my faith life. At one point, I decided that if the church had such disregard for her music, I didn't need to be a part of it. I stopped attending Mass. However, after a few weeks, I came to the conclusion that if Christ was willing to die for me, well, I could endure the pitiful music at Mass. I became one of probably millions who didn't think much of the new religion, but who believed that fulfilling the obligation to attend Mass was more important than the miserable music that would have to be endured fulfilling that obligation. In 1972, I transferred to Southern Methodist University. This turned out to be another pivotal time for me. The musical training was superb. The position I assumed in a Catholic parish while I was studying was challenging, partially because it became my first full-time job, and partially because I was pressured more and more to serve the parish with music that was up to date. It got to the point where if we sang something that was not contemporary pop music, it was completely out of sync with everything else, truly trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. However, the environment at the university provided a unique opportunity for me. For several years, I was enrolled in a Master of Sacred Music program, which was actually part of the university's seminary curriculum. So technically, I was enrolled as a seminarian. The program included a few theology courses, which were taught as one would expect from a Protestant perspective. It was the first time I was challenged to consider the teachings of the Catholic Church and to defend them. It was also the first time I realized how infused the post-conciliar church had become with Protestant thinking. My doctoral studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. during the late 1970s and early 1980s were also geared toward the training required to serve the new post-conciliar religion, except that at Catholic University, I was exposed to early chant manuscripts for the first time. In 1986, after 2 short-term posts, I joined the faculty of Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, as the choral director. I still worked in parishes part-time, but I no longer depended on parish work for my income. It was heavenly relief. At Gonzaga, I conducted 3 choirs. All 3 were devoted solely to the musical patrimony of the church. 1 choir sang a cappella literature, 1 choir sang the choral orchestral literature, and a chamber choir that sang mostly sacred music composed for small ensembles. The university administration would have preferred a jazz choir, but they gave me great autonomy, for which I will always be grateful. 1990 was my first step beyond what I'll call conservative Novus Ordo Catholicism toward tradition. That summer, I spent 2 weeks at the Benedictine monastery in Salem, France, studying chant. The Mass and the Divine Office at Salem are post-conciliar, but I was quite moved. I imagined that what I experienced there was probably a lot closer to what the Council Fathers had envisioned than what had actually happened. I came home with a commitment to restore chant to the liturgical life of the Church. I studied for several years to fill the void in my knowledge of chant. Then in 1997, I formed a schola, and we began to sing for Masses in a chapel on campus. It was a Novus Ordo Missae, but the entire Mass was sung, and it included the proper chants in Latin, a sung ordinary in Latin, either chant or polyphony, and various motets. The Mass attracted a few people, but never very many. Many older people who attended found it to be too much like the pre-conciliar Mass, which they had abandoned with glee. Students who attended found it to be unlike any Mass they had ever attended. For some, this was attractive. For others, it was just too unfamiliar. By 2005, 2 significant events were starting to shape my future. First, a priest in town had started saying the traditional Latin Mass. Now, I was unable to attend because of various Sunday morning responsibilities, but it did impact the attendance at our chapel Mass. Many people decided that a Reverend Novus Ordo was not an acceptable alternative to the TLM if it were available. Also, Gonzaga was quickly becoming a secular institution, where even conservative Catholicism was unacceptable, much less traditionalism. 2 years later, in 2007, I left Gonzaga after 21 years. It was a hard move. We had raised our children there. We had many good friends. We loved the city, our home, and the neighborhood. But university life was more than a job for me. It was a vocation. And Gonzaga was moving in a direction I could not follow. In addition, Pope Benedict XVI's Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum was promulgated in the summer of 2007. We decided that when we moved, we would only live somewhere where we could attend the traditional Latin Mass. We ended up, of all places, at the University of Florida, my first experience in a public institution, either as a student or as an employee. And we attended Mass at a TLM celebrated by the priests of the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter in Ocala, Florida, about an hour away. I became the Schola director almost immediately, and there was no turning back. The Schola was comprised almost entirely of students from UF, none of whom had ever experienced a traditional Latin Mass before joining this Schola. I recall that after the very first Mass for which we sing, one of the Schola members was standing quietly after Mass. I approached him and asked if it had been a good experience for him. He looked at me and said, "Why did we ever stop doing this?" Why, indeed. In 2014, my wife Karen and I were eating dinner and commiserating about the state of things in the church, and especially in Catholic education, a topic that took up far too much of our time. I said, almost in jest, maybe we should start a college. There was silence. Then Karen said, I think that would be a good idea. At the time, both of us had very comfortable and profitable positions. There would be absolutely no earthly benefit to us by taking on such a task. Nevertheless, I took her words to be divinely inspired. We moved forward, and we have not looked back with any regret, even as the task has proved much more difficult than we could have ever imagined. Anything labeled as traditional in the church today is targeted as anathema. The Collegium opened in 2021. Today, we are in our third and final location, Kansas City, Missouri, where we continue to face challenges because we embrace tradition. Nevertheless, every challenge is worth whatever effort is required to overcome it. We have shaped a curriculum, formation, community life, and a work program that are thoroughly Catholic and thoroughly traditional. The students who are drawn to this program are extraordinary. They will certainly become the leaders of the next generation, the leaders who will restore the Church to tradition and to sanity. So this is my story, but let me conclude with a few remarks for anyone who is considering tradition or is new to tradition and perhaps having difficulty with the struggles that seem to be inherent in the movement. First, you must know that there is no promise of earthly pleasure, comfort, or success through living a traditional Catholic life. To live a traditional Catholic life is to live in this world, but not become part of this world. It is a life that takes up a cross and follows Christ. Because of this, there is no promise that it will be easy. Surely it will not. In addition, and especially today, there is no guarantee that you won't suffer at the hands of people, especially members of the hierarchy, who seem determined to wipe out tradition. However, embracing traditional Catholicism will bring you peace. Peace from knowing that you are preserving those things given to us by Christ and the apostles, those things we were commanded to observe. Peace from knowing that your children raised in tradition have a far greater chance of staying close to the Church, where they can receive the sanctifying grace necessary for salvation, than do children raised in the post-conciliar religion. Peace from knowing that observing those things we were commanded to observe and that have been carefully handed down to us through the ages is the best way we can show our love for God. If ye love me, keep my commandments. And peace from knowing that if we love God with our whole heart, soul, and mind, even when it means taking up that cross, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man, what things God hath prepared for us.